Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another Legion class guide. This is an ongoing series where I go over the core gameplay of each class and spec in the Legion Alpha and sort of give you an idea of how they're played and how their core mechanics work. In this video, I'll be going over the Retribution Paladin. Retribution specs have some big changes this expansion. They're not as extreme as some specs. You're still on the holy power and mana resources. You combine raw physical power along with holy magic to take down your foes, and in this expansion, you have the iconic Ashbringer at your side. You'll be wielding it as an artifact, and you'll also be leading the Silver Hand in a campaign against the Burning Legion. I would say that overall we feel more like a melee class in this expansion, more so than we do in Draenor. A lot of long-range abilities such as Exorcism, for example, are gone, and they've been replaced with melee attacks. Now whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is up for you to decide, because as a disclaimer before we begin, the Paladin is not my main class on Live. I did a lot of training on both Live and Legion to get a solid understanding of how the Retribution spec plays and how it's changed, but keep in mind this is from a casual Paladin's perspective. Just something to remember when I talk about a spell or give my opinion on something. And by all means, if you catch any errors, feel free to let me know so I can patch them up with an annotation. Also keep in mind that this is all alpha gameplay, so things that you like or don't like are always subject to change. A lot of spells have been changed, removed, or added. As always, I'll go over all of them one by one in the spell book. And I'll also show them all in action so you can get a good idea of how the spec plays to see if you would like it or not. I'll sort of go over these in order of importance, putting a higher priority on the bread and butter abilities that make up the core of the Retribution spec, and at the end of the video, I'll show you some real fights and narrate them a bit so you can see how all of it comes together. As I'm going through these, keep an eye on the bottom right hand corner of the screen if you want to see the tooltips for the exact numbers and such. Let's start with our holy power generators. First up we have Crusader Strike. This deals a small amount of physical damage to a single target, and it generates 1 holy power. It has 2 charges and a base 4.5 second recharge. Next up we have Blade of Justice. This has a 12-yard range and it deals a medium amount of physical damage to your target. It generates 2 holy power and it has a base cooldown of 12 seconds. So this is a more powerful holy power generator. With Crusader Strike's low damage, it feels more like a nuisance spell that you have to go through to get to your big damage spells. You don't really feel that way with Blade of Justice though, due to its higher damage and better holy power generation. Next up we have our holy power spender, Templar's Verdict. This is a melee attack that takes 3 holy power to cast, and it deals some heavy holy damage. Not much to say here, this is just going to be your single target holy power dump. Next up we have our classic AoE holy power spender, Divine Storm. This also consumes 3 holy power, and it deals a small amount of holy damage to all enemies around you. And we of course still have Judgment. This has been changed a bit. This has a base 12-second cooldown, a 30-yard range, and it deals a heavy amount of holy damage to your target and causes it to take some extra damage from your holy power spenders for 6 seconds, which is increased by mastery. So you're always going to want to throw a Judgment on your target before using a holy power spender because the damage bonus is quite high. Next up we have our blessings. These were all reworked and for the better, I think. We have 3 different ones, the Blessing of Might, Kings, and Wisdom. First we have the DPS Blessing Might, which now gives an ally's attacks to have a 10% chance to deal 30% additional damage as holy. We also have a blessing for tanks, and that's Kings. This now puts an absorption shield on your target that'll refresh to its full strength every 6 seconds. And lastly for our healers we have Blessing of Wisdom, which causes your target to regenerate 1% of their maximum health and mana every 15 seconds. These still have durations of 1 hour, and you can only have 3 blessings active at one time, and it can be any combination. It doesn't have to be one of each. Next up we have our classic DPS cooldown, Avenging Wrath. This has a 2-minute cooldown, and it increases all damage and healing you deal by 35% for 20 seconds. So just a solid DPS cooldown as always. I think the 2-minute cooldown is pretty generous considering how powerful it is. Next up we have our defensive cooldown, Divine Shield. This bubbles you, preventing all damage for 8 seconds. It has a 5-minute cooldown, it triggers the Forbearance debuff for 30 seconds, and you can't use it if you have Forbearance active already. In Draenor, as you may know, this also used to reduce the damage you deal by 50% for its duration, so it's a little stronger in Legion. We also still have our Oh Crap button, and that's Lay on Hands. This heals a friendly target for an amount equal to your max health, so this is a huge heal. It has a 40-yard range, a 10-minute cooldown, and it causes Forbearance for 30 seconds, and of course it can't be used on a target already afflicted by Forbearance. Next up we have the Blessing of Protection. This has a 40-yard range, a 5-minute cooldown, and it makes your target immune to all physical attacks for 10 seconds. And just like Divine Shield, it causes Forbearance for 30 seconds, and you can't cast it if your target already has Forbearance. One thing to note is that you can now attack and use physical attacks when this is active. Next we have Shield of Vengeance. This absorbs a heavy amount of damage for 15 seconds, and when that barrier is consumed, all of the damage absorbed is dealt as holy damage divided across all enemies within 8 yards. This has a 2-minute cooldown and it's only castable on yourself. One thing to note is that you don't get the damage unless the shield is completely spent. If the duration wears off before it absorbs all of the damage, nothing happens. It's also a magic buff, so this is something that can be easily dispelled, which makes it pretty weak in PvP. Next up we have our classic Hammer of Justice. This stuns your target for a whopping 6 seconds, it has a 1-minute cooldown, and a 10-yard range. This is really strong as always, but we have some talents that makes it even more powerful that I'll go over later. Next up we have Blessing of Freedom. No big changes here aside from an increase in duration. This makes your target immune to movement impairing effects like slows or roots for 8 seconds up from the 6 seconds in Draenor. It has a 40-yard range and a 25-second cooldown. We also have the Hand of Hindrance. This is our replacement to Seal of Justice. This slows your target's movement speed by 70% for 10 seconds. It has a 30-yard range and a 30-second cooldown. The cooldown is really harsh. Don't get me wrong, a 70% slow with a 30-yard range is really nice, but that's a whopping 20 seconds of downtime, which is definitely going to hurt us in PvP. And finally we have Flash of Light. This is a base 1.5 second cast small heal. At level 100 and eye level 680 it heals for nearly 10% of your life, so it's not too bad. It's not something you can spam though due to its high mana cost. And that's pretty much it, for all of the important stuff anyways. Everything else I didn't mention are still functionally the same pretty much, maybe just percentage or cooldown changes. I'll mouse over them here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers. But abilities I haven't mentioned yet are Cleanse Toxins, Hand of Reckoning, Rebuke, and Redemption. Next I'll go over our passives. First up we have our new mastery, Divine Judgment. This increases the damage of your judgment as you stack it, and like I said earlier, it also causes your judgment to increase the amount of damage taken from your holy power spenders. We also have Retribution. This one is pretty interesting. This gives you a 50% increase in damage for 10 seconds whenever a party member within 40 yards of you dies. It's a pretty unique passive, and I think it's going to shine in PvP especially. We also have the Heart of the Crusader, which gives you a passive 20% mount speed increase. And lastly we have the Sword of Light passive, which just gives you a flat 5% increase in two-handed weapon damage. And that's every ability and passive. If I didn't list anything from Draenor, it was either moved to talents, removed entirely, or they just haven't put it back yet. Next up I'll go over the revamped talents, and just like the abilities and passives, I'll go over every single talent and show you them in action. I'll also have a link to the talent calculator in the description if you want to see them for yourself. First up, for the level 15 tier we have Final Verdict, which is now a passive. This now increases the damage of your Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm spells by 20%. Not much to say here, just a nice buff to your holy power spenders. Next up we have Execution Sentence, which has seen a rework. This now costs 3 holy power, and instead of a dot it deals a huge amount of holy damage to your target after a base 10 seconds after casting it. It has a 20-second cooldown and a 20-yard range. Its damage is about 3 times the amount of damage of Templar's Verdict, and because it's a holy power spender, its damage is also increased by Judgment. As long as Judgment is active when it pops, you'll get that bonus damage. This gives us some big burst potential, but a big downside PvP wise is that it's a magic debuff, so it's dispellable. The 10-second delay is plenty of time for people to dispel this, so I don't think it'll be too useful against adept players. Next up we have Consecration, which of course is our AoE. This consecrates the land beneath you, causing a medium amount of holy damage to all enemies within the area over a base 9 seconds, and it has a 9-second cooldown, so this is something you can have 100% uptime on. For the level 30 tier we have Fires of Justice. This reduces the cooldown of your Crusader Strike by 1 second, and it also gives it a 25% chance to reduce the cost of your next Holy Power ability by 1. This is a really strong passive. One thing to keep in mind is that the buff from Judgment only lasts for 6 seconds. If you have this talent, you'll be able to squeeze in more Templar's Verdicts for that bonus damage, which is nice. Next up we have Zeal. This replaces Crusader Strike. It deals slightly more damage, and it also has the effect where further Zeals chain to nearby targets. Each stack increases the maximum amount of targets, and it caps out at 3. So that's 4 targets per Zeal at 3 stacks, which is pretty good. And it has 2 charges and a base 4.5 second cooldown, just like Crusader Strike. Next up we have Greater Judgment. This causes your Judgment to deal an additional 50% damage, have a 100% increased duration, and causes it to jump to 3 additional enemies. This one is also really nice, not just for the damage, but the increased duration allows you to have the Judgment debuff up 100% of the time, so it makes it easier to time your holy power spenders. The additional enemies hit also get the debuff, so this makes your Divine Storm better as well. For the level 45 tier we have Fist of Justice, which has seen a rework. I think this is going to be a must-have for PvP. This causes your damage dealing holy power spenders to also reduce the remaining cooldown of your Hammer of Justice by 10 seconds. Hammer has a 1 minute cooldown already, so this lets you put them out at a pretty rapid pace. It's going to depend on your talent choice and uptime on your target, but on average you'll only have a 20 to 25 second downtime if you're spending holy power as fast as you can. Next up we have our classic Repentance, which has seen a change. This still incapacitates your target for 1 minute, but now they also take up to a maximum of 25% of their life as damage over that duration, and the damage doesn't break the effect. So not only does this take an enemy out of the fight for a minute, but it also takes a decent chunk of their life as well. This has a 15-second cooldown, a 30-yard range, and it's usable on demons, dragonkin, giants, humanoids, and undead. And lastly, for the level 45 tier, we have Blinding Light. This deals a medium amount of damage to all enemies within 10 yards and disorients them for 6 seconds. And this has a 1.5 minute cooldown. A neat thing about this is that holy damage won't break the effect, so you can think of this as a 6-second AoE stun as long as you're only using holy damage. This gives more value to the Greater Judgment talent because it's all holy. Zeal on the other hand is physical damage, so it breaks the effect unfortunately. For the level 60 tier we have Virtue's Blade. This causes your Blade of Justice critical strikes to deal 3 times normal damage. When they say normal damage here they mean a non-crit. In PvE a normal crit is 200% of an ability's base damage, so this talent bumps it up to 300% normal damage when you crit. Next up we have Blade of Wrath. This replaces Blade of Justice. It has a base 8-second cooldown as opposed to Blade of Justice's 12 seconds, but it also deals less damage. It still generates 2 holy power, and it also has that 12-yard range. So this just helps out with your holy power generation, although the damage is quite low. It's about 25% the damage of Blade of Justice, but you also get to use it 33% more often. Next up we have Divine Hammer. This also replaces Blade of Justice. This causes Divine Hammers to spin around you, damaging enemies within 8 yards for a small amount of holy damage every 2 seconds over 8 seconds, which is increased by haste. It has a base 8-second cooldown, and it generates 1 holy power. So this is just another option for AoE damage. Over its full duration it's about 60% the damage of Blade of Justice, so it's something you want to use for single target fights still. For the level 75 tier we have Justicar's Vengeance. This consumes a full 5 holy power and it deals a heavy amount of holy damage to your target. It also restores health equal to the amount of damage done, so it's a nice heal as well. I'd say just that alone makes it a good ability, but this also has the effect to where if you use it on a stun target it deals 100% additional damage and healing. Combine this with the fact it's also a holy power spender and therefore affected by your Judgment Mastery makes this hit like a truck. Another thing to note is that it combos really well with your Fist of Justice talent because you have those rapid hammers of justice, so getting a stun out is going to be pretty easy. Next up we have Eye for an Eye. This reduces the amount of physical damage you take by 35%, and every time someone hits you with a melee attack, you counterattack for a medium amount of physical damage. It lasts for 10 seconds and it has a 1 minute cooldown. The damage is about half of Templar's Verdict, so it's not too bad. Next up we have Word of Glory, which has seen a revamp. This is now a cooldown ability. This costs 3 holy power and it heals both you and 5 friendly targets within 15 yards of you for a small amount. It has 2 charges and a 1 minute cooldown. This is something I think we should have as a baseline ability. Our only other heal at the moment, not counting Lay on Hands, is Flash of Light, which I think is really wrong considering we're paladins. Our whole gimmick is that we're warriors of light, and you would think that we would have more healing spells at our disposal to help out our allies when they're in a pinch. It's another example of ability pruning gone too far, I think. Anyway, that's my rant for now. Next up, for the level 90 tier, we have Divine Intervention. This reduces the cooldown of your Divine Shield by 50%, and attacks that would normally kill you instead reduce you to 20% of your maximum health, and trigger Divine Shield as long as it's not on cooldown and you don't have Forbearance. So this is just a really nice defensive cooldown to have. Next up we have Divine Steed. This summons a holy charger for you to ride, increasing your movement speed by 100% for 3 seconds. It has a 45-second cooldown and it's usable indoors or in combat. All of you Diablo 3 players out there may recognize this. This is actually used by the Crusader in that game. It's pretty interesting, although a bit buggy. It says you can use it indoors, but as of this alpha build that only works like 50% of the time, so they definitely have to work on this one a bit more. One thing to note is that you can attack freely while it's active and it won't disappear. It's not too bad, but I think the 45-second cooldown is a little harsh. I think somewhere around 30 seconds would be a little more reasonable. Next up we have Seal of Light. This costs anywhere to 1 to 5 holy power, and it increases your movement speed by 20% for 20 seconds per holy power spent. Surprisingly, the thing that's increased with holy power is the duration, with a maximum of 100 seconds at a full 5 holy power. I think this is a clear winner over Divine Steed due to its consistency. There's no cooldown on this, so this is something you can have up 100% of the time, which is great. For the level 100 tier, we have Blessing of Justice. This increases the effect of your greater blessings by 100%. For might, the 10% chance to proc becomes 20%. For wisdom, you gain 2% health and mana every 15 seconds. And for kings, the absorb shield is doubled. So with this, our buffs really become a force to be reckoned with, and I for one am going to love seeing Retribution Paladins in my group when this expansion releases. Next up, we have Holy Wrath. This is another big DPS cooldown. This fires holy bolts at a single target, causing a heavy amount of holy damage and generates 5 holy power over 2.4 seconds. It has a 30-yard range and a 2-minute cooldown. This gives us a ton of burst if you combine it with Avenging Wrath, and I'm sure it's going to be very appealing for PvP. And finally, for the level 100 tier, we have Equality. This one is pretty unique. This deals holy damage up to 3 enemies within 10 yards equal to 100% of your missing health. It has a 5-minute cooldown. It can't be used while you have Forbearance, but it also doesn't cause Forbearance. Its damage is reduced in PvP, which is understandable. It would be pretty broken because we would basically just one-shot whoever we're fighting. And that's it for all of the talents, as of this alpha build anyways. Next up, I'll talk about the artifact for the Retribution Paladin, and that's the iconic two-handed sword, Ashbringer. This has an ability itself called Wake of Ashes. This slams the Ashbringer on the ground, dealing some radiant damage to all enemies within 12 yards in front of you. Enemies hit have their movement speed reduced by 50% for 6 seconds, and demon or undead enemies are also stunned for 6 seconds. It has a 30-second cooldown, which is pretty low considering some of the other artifact abilities. It also helps our cutting situation a bit. Even still, with both this and Hand of Hindrance, that's 14 seconds of downtime on slows, which is still pretty bad. Ashbringer also has some interesting passives you can unlock. You can find calculators for this all over the place. I'll have a link in the description, but I'll go over the more major ones here. First up, we have Ashes to Ashes. This causes your Wake of Ashes ability to also generate 5 holy power, and it causes all enemies hit by it to burn for some heavy radiant damage over 6 seconds. This is a huge buff to this ability. Combine this with a short 30-second cooldown makes this a really solid artifact ability. We also have Echo of the High Lord. This causes Ashbringer to mimic Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm, casting it a second time. Not too much to say here, just a really powerful trait that helps us in both AoE and single target. And we have Divine Tempest. This increases Divine Storm's damage by 20%, and it also causes your Ashbringer to cast another Divine Storm forward 20 yards, damaging all enemies in its path. The rest of these are pretty generic, some interesting stuff, but mainly just percentage increases to abilities and such. I'll mouse over these here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to read them. And like I said, I'll have a link to that calculator in the description if you want to check them out. You don't have to choose between any of these traits, you'll be able to get them all eventually. You just need to get enough artifact power, which you'll get by questing, PvPing, raiding, and so on. And that's it for all of the abilities, talents, and artifact traits, at least for this alpha build anyways. I'm sure they'll add more or change some stuff later on, but that's okay because the purpose of this video is just to give you a basic idea of how the spec is played, and that's something that's very unlikely to change as they update the game. Now let's put all of this together. The only way to get an idea of how the spec is played is to see it in action, so as always I'll show you some basic fights here and narrate them a bit. Here are some single target fights. For talents I have Blessings of Justice to make my buffs better, and I also have Justicar's Vengeance for that big damage and heal. I'm also comboing that with Fist of Justice for those rapid hammers of justice. As far as the rotation is concerned, honestly it's awkward with the current way your Mastery and Judgment work right now. Remember, Judgment increases the amount of damage your target takes from Holy Spenders for 6 seconds, but it has a cooldown of 12 seconds. This causes you to run into situations where you're full on Holy Power and you're ready to spend it, but your Judgment is on cooldown and the debuff just wore out. So you're stuck sitting there auto-attacking for a while until Judgment comes back off cooldown so you can use your Holy Spender. It makes the whole spec feel really clunky, and I think this pretty much makes the Greater Judgment talent a must-have, because without it, it's just frustrating to time everything correctly. Remember that Greater Judgment talent causes the debuff to last for 12 seconds, so you no longer have that downtime. A simple fix for this would be to have Judgment's debuff last for a base 12 seconds. Either that or just change the Mastery, because as it stands right now, it's more of a hindrance than anything else. Another thing worth noting, and maybe it's just me, but Red Paladins feel very wrong without Hammer of Wrath. Once I get to that 35% range, I still find myself looking for that skill. We really feel naked without it. As far as I know, we've had that since vanilla. There really was no reason to take it out in my opinion. Anyways, here are some AoE fights. For talents I have Consecration, Greater Judgment, Blinding Light, Divine Hammer, Eye for an Eye, pretty much all of the AoE I can get. And with all of that, I think our AoE is decent. The only problem I see is that pretty much all of it is in talents. Not including talents, our only AoEs are Divine Storm and Wake of Ashes. I think having a couple more baseline AoE abilities would be great. A good fix for this would be to make Zeal a baseline ability and make it not replace Crusader Strike. This way we could have both a single target and an AoE holy power generator. Crusader Strike would also need to be buffed though, because as it stands right now, Zeal is better in pretty much every regard. And here's a longer single target fight. I have pretty much the same talents as my short single target fight, except I have greater judgment because I don't want to deal with that awkward timing. I did also grab Execution Sentence so I can show off a little burst, and I also have Holy Wrath just for the sake of showing it in action. And there's really not much to say that I haven't said already. I guess one thing is now I don't have the Fires of Justice talent, so the rotation is even more simple. Overall our damage isn't anything special, but it's not bad either. Keep in mind that this is without artifact traits, and we have some good ones, so definitely don't take this as a final product. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you have a better understanding and feel of how their core gameplay works. The spec does have some problems, I think. A lot of people are letting their voices be heard on the forums though, so hopefully Blizzard listens and makes some changes for the better. I think the biggest problem we face right now is the overall clunkiness of the spec. Like I say in all of these videos, I don't really focus on the damage numbers since they're always subject to change. I think the more important thing right now is how the spec feels and plays, and it definitely has some problems. A big one is we have no proc-based abilities aside from one in the talents, so the rotation is pretty dull. You basically just wait on your cooldowns to refresh, and there's nothing to keep you on your toes aside from the Fire of Justice talent if you took it. And that's in the same tier as the Greater Judgment talent, which is the only thing that fixes our awkward mastery, so it's like pick your poison. Another thing I mentioned earlier is that a lot of the ability pruning didn't make sense. I mean, it's been a while since I played Retribution spec seriously, but as I remember, it's never been the most complex spec to play. Some specs I can definitely understand ability pruning, not Retribution though. Specifically, I think we should have our old Word of Glory, Exorcism, and most importantly, Hammer of Wrath back as baseline spells, because right now we just don't have enough buttons to press. So there's a lot of room for improvement. They also did a lot of things right though, I think. I love the changes to her blessings, and Ashbringer is an awesome artifact in my opinion. The class identity is what it should be, and overall I have an optimistic outlook for this spec as long as they fix those issues I mentioned earlier. And remember, at the end of the day it is still alpha. That's why we have it, so we can test everything out, so Blizzard knows what to fix before release. Also remember that Paladin isn't my main class on live servers, so my critique is from a very casual perspective, so take that as you will. Feel free to leave me a message about your opinion on the state of Retribution spec for Legion, especially all of you veteran Paladins out there. I'd like to hear a pro's perspective on how this class is changing and if you think it's for the better or for worse. Whether or not you like the changes, I hope you at least found the video informative, interesting, or entertaining in some way. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching it. Thanks for checking it out. I'll be doing guides like this for every spec for every class in the game, so keep an eye out for those if you're interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave me a message. There's always room for improvement. If you want to see more Retribution gameplay, I also did a full dungeon run. No commentary on that though, just some raw gameplay for those of you who want to see more of what this spec is capable of. I'll have an annotation for that right here and a link in the description if you want to see that. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a like if you liked it, and if you really liked it, let me know in the comments and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and peace!